Hey, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Spirit-Anointed Leadership. So blessed to have you here today. You know, this podcast is all about doing everything we can to encourage, equip, and empower you as we go after the mission that God has given us together. Today, I'm really excited about the fact that you've joined us because my friend Jon Allen has joined us. Jon, great to have you. Finally got you on the podcast.
Yeah,
Took
thanks,
way too long, but I'm glad that you're with us.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being with us. Now, Jon, you and I both know that I could have had you on Spirit-Anointed Leadership Podcast for a host of different reasons. You and I could talk about what it's like to be a dad of daughters, and what that journey is like. Yep. And we've had some fun around that. And but I wanted you, and seriously, there are a lot of other things that we could talk about because the Lord really has filled your heart and your spirit with some wisdom. I love the way that you interact with people who have significant financial means and how God has helped you navigate those conversations with folks and just do it in a really natural way and found your rhythm in that. But I really felt a prompting from Holy Spirit to ask you to come and talk about something that you'd probably rather not talk about, which is leading through challenging or difficult times, right? Yeah. I mean, you don't want it, no one wants to be the poster child for that, right? Yeah. We'd like to be the poster child for how to lead when everything is going up and to the right all the time. Yeah. But that hasn't been your experience, and yet you're one of the best leaders I know, even in the midst of that. So why don't you, for those who don't know you, like I'm blessed and privileged to know you, you planted a church called Journey Church, but go back a little bit before that.
Sure.
Where'd you grow up? How'd you get called to ministry? And then how'd you end up actually at Journey Church? Give us a couple minute rundown of your life and how you ended up at Journey.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for the honor to be here too. Kind words. Appreciate that. I actually grew up in Battle Creek, so at a church in the region. It was called First West at the time and Woodland now. And at that point, it was a very life-giving place. Bob Zool was the pastor. And really, over the years, a ton of us came out and went into ministry. Wow. And there was no real strategy for that. He didn't have a plan or some development program. Just a lot of us over probably a 20-year window came out and went into ministry in different places.
This has nothing to do with the podcast, but I got to ask you.
Yeah.
As you look back, what do you think was true about that? Was there something about Bob that caused so many people to end up being called into ministry? Because as you said, there wasn't a strategy for it.
It's a great question. I wonder, for me at least, it was this really great exposure of how something could be pretty healthy in the church world and have and be led by somebody with a true leadership capacity. Wow. I mean, who really did want things to move, who really wanted to advance the mission, who was willing to take risks, who was willing to kind of be out on the front edge of some things. Yes. And I wouldn't have known it as a kid and as a teenager, but that was attractive to me. Wow. To say, okay, it can be this way. So at least for me, that's probably, and just that it was a pretty life-giving environment. Yeah. I mean, it was a great place to grow. It was a great place to have fun. It was a great relational place. So there's a lot of those dynamics probably. Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah. Your experience with Bob Zool, my experience first with Orval Butcher and then with John Maxwell. Our churches were life-giving churches. Yes. And it's amazing how impactful that can be. Yes. Which is why we pray so hard that the churches that we lead would be life-giving churches as well, right? Yes. Okay, so you grew up in Battle Creek at First West, now it's called Woodland. Yeah. Spent some time at Indiana Wesleyan. Spent a couple of years in Corning, New York, at a church called Victory Highway. Okay. Had a great couple of year experience there. My wife, Eric, and I got married. She was with me my second year there. Okay. We then spent 10 years in Roanoke, Virginia on staff at a church, which were great years for us. Sometimes hard years, but great years. We went through an infertility journey there to where our girls were actually born. The church had a lot of significant growth and a relocation process. And along the way there, just somewhere began to say, boy, I think if I don't try and lead somewhere, I'm going to be 80 years old and regret it. And I was leading. I had a lot of room to fail there. It was a very safe environment. My pastor at the time was very gracious, and he let me start preaching on things like vision and vision messages and key DNA elements to our church. And I did it. I was like, oh no, this might be bad. I like this. I want to do this more. Wow. And so super supportive environment, super sending environment when it was time for us to plant. They supported our plant for 4 years from a distance. So that was really, really meaningful.
And you didn't multiply, you didn't plant right next door to the next community or whatever.
No, they were in Virginia. We planted up here in West Michigan. And so a significant distance that they just really stayed involved with us for as long as they could. And it was great. We were grateful for that. But that led us to Plant Journey. We did explore, would we take an existing church or would we plant somewhere?
Okay.
And really in that process, just realized, boy, we need to plant. We really think we've got to try something. I had a lot of disqualifiers in my head that the Lord just gradually, one by one, picked those out and said, hey, that's not a disqualifier. This is just who you are, and let's do this. We knew we couldn't parachute drop. We knew we weren't really wired for that. I'm not an extrovert by nature. I wasn't going to go meet 100 people in Starbucks. That's not who I'm going to be.
Right.
KCC was ready to plant again, so had some interactions with Pastor Wayne at the time, and we kind of found a community that made sense for them, one that made sense for us, and so we launched out of there.
Okay. So when did Journey actually launch? What year was that?
Yeah, so we hit the ground June of 2007, and we launched in October 2007.
There you go.
So yeah, looking back, that's ridiculous, but that's what we knew. That's what everybody knew at the time, right? That's all that people knew at the time, and so that's what we did.
Yep.
And if we could go back, we would do lots of those things differently. But it's what we knew. It's what we did.
Right.
And so yeah, we launched in just a matter of a few months. And the really funny part of that was we finished in Virginia on a Sunday.
Okay.
The following Saturday, 6 days later, we were on the stage at KCC saying we're going to plant this church. And I literally had to say to them in front of all these people at KCC on a Saturday night, we're going to plant Caledonia, and I can't get there from here. It's one town over. I couldn't get there. But it was all so new and so fresh to us that we literally didn't know. That's how fast things were moving. It was too fast, but it's how fast things were moving.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when Journey first started, you guys were meeting in a high school or
a middle school. We were
sorry.
meeting in a middle school. It used to be the old high school. We met 3 years in a cafeteria, 4 in an auditorium in that school.
Okay, so 7 years in an auditorium, and then eventually you moved into the facility that you guys have now, which we might get to in a few minutes. But so what would you say, Jon, was the first time you really hit a wall where you said, oh my gosh, it is hard to lead during this season? Like, you know, this is a challenge. Maybe we don't have the big mo. We don't have momentum right now. It's a challenge. When was the first time that happened for you at Journey?
Yeah, it was probably like 3 things that pushed themselves together real close when our first really hard time. And honestly, it was year 4. We had some bumps in the first 3 years, but we were very fortunate. In year 4, we kind of had our first exodus, and I think every church planter has an exodus at some point, right? And if they haven't, I don't want to hear their story, probably, but they all have an exodus, and we had an exodus. And in that exodus, it wasn't just people exited. Some people lied about us. Some people in the community started saying things about us that weren't true. It was a very hard season to say what just happened. How did all this take shape? Soon after that, a good move was the guy who had come to help me plant the church, Ben Ward. We knew one day he would go to the mission field and hit that time, and we sent him, and we still support him. He's still one of my greatest friends, but it was a hard loss. He had been with us those in early years.
He's like, Ben, if you could have left like a year before that or a year after, would have been great. But you've got the great exodus, and you've got Ben. Was Ben there from the very beginning?
Yeah, he moved to West Michigan, having never been here, to help us launch the church.
So you kind of lose your right-hand person.
Absolutely. Yeah, lose the guy. So we had an exodus, and then we had an exit. And then right after that, the person, we shuffled the deck when Ben left on our structure, and the person that we hired really had some significant potential. We knew we were very close to moving into our building. We actually had offices in our building, but we're still on Sundays in the school. That person hadn't been with us long, and some things came up that we didn't know about, that we had to make some really tough decisions to navigate that. And those are always hard. It became really painful. It became very legal for a little bit and very challenging. And on the Sunday that we had to announce that to our church, we literally were in the process of announcing it. One of our advisory team members was announcing it, and a lady stood up and began to walk down the aisle in our auditorium, just shouting us and yelling at me and accusing us of things, like right in the middle of our service.
In the middle of the service.
In the middle of our service. Just had gone off the rails. And I just had never been trained to respond to anything like that. And that was just one of these lowest points where we thought, I remember thinking, I just don't know. Like, are we going to make it? Can I do it? How will we survive it? I grieved having to make the decision. The guy and I had connected quickly. And there was just a lot of weight that had gone into those last couple of years to be topped off with that. And that was one of the first really hard times where I thought, I just don't know. And probably only stayed, honestly, because in that season, I still remember very clearly the Sunday afternoon where God, just as clearly as you and I are sitting here, said to me, John, if you leave now, that'll be sin. You just don't have my permission to leave.
Wow. But there was something inside of you that wanted to.
Oh, I was looking for the exits.
Yes.
Yeah, I was looking for the exits. And so I'm grateful for the Lord's clarity in that. I needed it to be that clear. Just, this is not going to be good.
Right.
And so that was one of the first really difficult seasons where in every way, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, relationally in the church, all of it felt hard all at once. And it felt like the junk had more momentum than anything else.
Wow, that's a powerful line. It felt like the junk had more momentum than anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you and I both know you just don't sweet talk yourself out of those seasons.
Yeah.
Part of it is that you just have to get up the next day and go, quote unquote, back to work.
Yeah.
And keep going.
Yeah.
And is that right? I mean, you just put one foot in front of the other, even though you don't want to, even though you're hurt and you're mad and you're frustrated and people don't know the real story. They don't know everything. My guess is that this woman who got up and started screaming, which is totally inappropriate, of course, for her to do.
Sure, yeah.
But she doesn't know the whole story.
Right.
She doesn't know everything that you know. And you can't disclose everything.
Can't say everything. You can't. Yeah, right. You can't say everything. And
right.
And we didn't want to say everything. I mean, we weren't trying to ruin anybody. And there was a thin line there, right? And so those days are hard. And, those are the days where there's a couple Sundays in that middle school auditorium. There was this huge screen that the school let us use that kind of went from ceiling to floor. And I remember a couple times between services sitting behind that screen thinking, I won't even make it to the next one. Like I just, and there were a couple of really good people who just were willing to pray and fight with us through that season. But they just a couple. It was a thin crowd at that moment.
Right.
And so, those are just hard days. For sure. And I don't think they're unique to us. I think we all have them, right?
Yes.
We've just had a few.
Yeah. And so I want to parse through one more story, and then I want to talk more globally about how you navigate those things. But then eventually you guys moved into your facility, did some great stuff there. And we could talk about that too. There's some stories there. But so you guys are growing, things are happening, and then this bloke, Chris Conrad, comes to you and says, hey, Jesus loves you, and I have a wonderful plan for your life.
Yeah.
There's a facility down the road. Remind me, how far down is it down the road from?
Yeah, it's just one town below us. I mean, you could be from one of our locations to the other in less than 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I come to you and I say, hey, we've got this church, and they've kind of done their life cycle. Bless their hearts there.
Yep.
Don't have a whole lot of life and momentum left, but what might it look like for Journey Church to go in there and kind of not even adopt them, but kind of kind of shut them down for a little while and then reopen. Yeah. And so you guys agreed to do that. You prayed through it. You prayed through it and said, yes, God is in this. So you say, yes, we're going to do it. And you recognize we're going to have to do some renovations here to make this what we want it to be. And so you're in the midst of those renovations. And then in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is, 1 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call.
Yeah.
I think from your wife, Erica. I can't actually remember.
Yeah, it was.
From Erica saying, come now. What had happened? What was going on?
Well, can I give you one piece of that backstory? So when you called us about doing that, just over 48 hours before, we had been in a discernment weekend processing what we were going to do. And I thought, I'm going to have to convince these people that we need to plant or launch or do something different. And 11 out of 12 of them, this discernment process, before I'd ever said anything, said we should launch a location. And so then 48 hours later, you're calling and you're talking about that. And I'm like, well, yeah, I guess, yes. I mean, we just kind of did this.
Yes.
Yeah. So we do it. We work through a whole process. We get into this building. About 4 weeks before we're going to open up and do a grand opening in that building, one of our pastors, who's actually going to be the campus pastor and is now the campus pastor, calls me. It's about 10 o'clock at night. And he says, John, the Middleville location is burning, and this is not a joke. And I was, well, okay. So we go down and we call you. And so that thing burns to the ground. The worship center piece that burns completely to the ground, which hurdles us into a really long, cumbersome insurance rebuild process, how to get parts, how to keep a foundation. It just was a very arduous, slow process for the next 18 to 24 months. And then ironically, we finally get through all that and get in and actually have a grand opening. And 4 weeks later, COVID hits. So we periodically celebrate that we had that property 3 years and it had 4 services. So good for us. And yeah, I don't know if that's something to be celebrated, but we have.
Wow. Okay. So John, you and I would converse during that time. So the building burns to the ground.
Yep.
You've discerned you're supposed to be doing this. Building burns to the ground. And then there are these insurance things that you got to go through, and there's some interesting things that we could talk about as far as that is concerned. But you get on the other side. But now it's just building, getting the right subs there, and getting everyone there. And as you just said, took a long time.
Yeah.
And so the church is meeting now in a rented. They were meeting in a rented facility.
We did, after a year of waiting, we did go ahead and meet in a rented facility.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what did it feel like? Like how in the world, John, do you continue to give hope when you're 19 or 20 months into this thing, and you were vision casting it before you moved in?
Yeah.
Right. So that he could have a launch team, and now so you've moved there already with at least a launch team, right?
Oh, yeah.
Just moved there.
Yeah.
You're going there, and here we go. And then 4 weeks before you start, the whole thing burns to the ground. And now you're 24 months, and then you got 4 weeks, and then you've got COVID.
Right.
How in the world, John, how do you lead? That's the 30,000 question.
Yeah.
30,000. How do you lead during those times? What happens inside of your spirit, and how in the world do you give hope to other people in the midst of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for some, like first for me, I had to make sure I had the right people. And when it started, I didn't know who all the right people were.
Okay.
I needed some people who could navigate it. I needed some people who could hear me and all of the range of my emotions and thoughts in it. And
that's important. You've got to have those safe people.
Yeah, they had to be like safe people who were also in the process with me, so we could talk the same language. I did have to have some outside people like you and others that I could just vent to, who maybe weren't in the inner daily working with me, but were invested.
Right.
And so that was really significant. The right people with me, and some of them were not with me before we started that. We know they had a unique skill set that could help us with this arduous insurance process, and so we brought them in and we trusted their heart, and they got the mission. A second thing was, though, I really realized I really needed the fullness of God in that season. Like I needed the God who, was for us and would comfort us and prop our heads up and everything. But I needed the God who also could handle my frustration and anger and my own senses of failure and questioning that came with, were we doing the right thing? Now are we doing the right thing? We've never led through something like this. I just needed the whole of God, in that season. Which was just really significant. And then somewhere, and this came a lot from other people, I somehow just had to have the faith, and it really was just faith that God would build something good, not just in Journey, but in me in this. Like I just had to feel, hope came a lot, just knowing, okay, God really won't let anything be wasted. There will be something built in me. And I had to borrow people's faith on that sometimes, which was a phrase we've talked about a lot about. But I had to borrow people's faith on that sometimes just to kind of say, okay, we can get through. Yeah, then that was just for me. And then leading people was this different dynamic of trying to understand when something goes that long, when do you provide care, and then when do you kind of push the cause and the mission? Because the mission, it is part of the healing, right? The mission is part of the healing. It can't be just this healing thing.
Right.
But man, it's a dance when it's that long of what do we need in which season. And I think that's always part of leadership. What do we need in each season? But when you're trying to keep a vision and an inspiration that has been so paused by things you can't control, that was a test to our leadership to learn how to say, okay, in this season, we've really got to push the mission because that's part of how we're going to care for people. And the beauty of that was our launch team grew in that stage, which I thought we'd lose our whole launch team. It actually grew, almost doubled in that phase, which was just the grace of God in that and people being willing. Yeah.
So, John, if you don't mind, I want to pull that apart for just a second.
Yep.
And that is that I love the brilliance, again, the wisdom that God gave you during that season. If you provide only care and no vision, then probably the vision's going to die, and they're going to start saying, we don't need to do this thing at all. Like, we can just give this up. Like, we don't need to relaunch, whatever. If you give nothing but vision, we're going after it, and no care, talk to me about what happened then. What would happen then?
Yeah, I think if we would have in that season given all vision, all mission, and no care, I think we would have run into the next season of the battle with very wounded people, very tired, worn out, confused.
Yes.
People were like, there was a shock element for our people.
Sure.
It's just like what just happened, and now what do we do? Right. And if we would have let only vision.
Hang on one second. I want you to continue on that, but because it's easy. Well, this place burned down. And what people don't know, what we haven't shared, is that it happened to be a subcontractor and a young kid who was, if I remember right, pretty early on the job.
Yes.
This is one of his first things ever.
Yeah.
And if I remember right, so correct me if I'm wrong, it was a spark that caught some insulation.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so everybody, it wasn't like, the kid didn't even know that he had done anything wrong. Right?
Yes.
So a spark ends up catching the insulation, which catches the whole thing on fire, costs you 18 to 24 months.
Yeah.
And I could foresee people coming to you and say, oh, God must not be in it.
Yeah.
Because if he was in it, he wouldn't have let that happen.
Yeah. There was certainly a little bit of that. Yeah, there was certainly a bit of that. And there was a little bit of who can we blame? And neither one of those are like great, healthy responses, which is why you've got to care somewhere. Right? If you just run to the mission, they're going to bring the this isn't God or the who are we going to blame. It's like somewhere you got to help counsel out of that, lead out of that a little bit.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want to blame. It was truly an accident. It's the picture of an accident, right?
Yes.
But then even when insurance dragged its feet and people for a little bit, a small number of people question our integrity. Did we even have insurance? Is this really true? It's like, okay, we're not going to throw people under the bus. So how do we care for them before we push the mission again, so they're not bringing all of this junk to the next phase of the mission? So, and again, I think that's a dance, or to use your word, a discernment process constantly of where are we?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Jon, you're sitting you're in front of a room of, I don't care, however many, 100 pastors who are in some way, shape, or form stuck. They're in my Madison situation where the thing isn't growing the way that I wish it would, or they're in a situation like you've been in several times where the woman stands up, that going back to your first story, the woman stands up and does what she does. And it's the day after that kind of thing. What do you say, Jon? You're in a room full of God. I just think the Holy Spirit has brought you through some great things. I really appreciated a few minutes ago you talking about, I learned about the full counsel of God. I learned some things about God during that season that I probably wouldn't have learned if I wouldn't have been through that. But what would you say to a room full of folks that are going through a tough season? What would be your last?
Yeah, honestly, I think the first thing I'd say is I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I feel for people in that spot. And we've been in it since then. We'll be in it again, right? It is part of the ministry journey, right? It's part of the leadership journey. But genuinely, I'm sorry because nothing feels quite like that.
Yeah.
The weight of that, the discouragement that can come, or the confusion, the questions that aren't always healthy questions. I'm sorry for what you're in this moment. And then I might say, one of the best things I learned in that time was from Tim Keller in a devotional on Psalms. He'd written in talking about Psalm 23, when he talks about the end of Psalm 23 and goodness and mercy following us. It being these examples that nothing gets into our life, nothing attacks us that God doesn't know and that God can't somehow redeem. And it's hard in the moment to remember that.
Yes.
But God really is redeeming something. He's relentlessly trying to redeem things in that crisis and in that stuckness and trying to just offer some hope in that part of God. Yeah.
And that's powerful. I think two things here, Jon. I think, first of all, just saying you're sorry. It kind of goes back to Job's friends, right? When they just showed up, if they just would have kept their mouth shut, right? If they just would have come and hung out with them instead of started talking. And sometimes when we just say, hey, I'm sorry, I don't have the solution for you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to sit in it with you.
Yeah.
And then recognizing God is so sovereign and he's so powerful.
Yeah.
He does have the ability to redeem all things.
Yeah.
I think what you just said and what Rick Warren said years ago is, God can redeem anything. It can bring so much, because we look at situations, we say, how in the world can you redeem this?
Yeah.
Just watch.
Yeah.
And, it may not be right this moment. You might not be able to see it, but eventually, watch as I can redeem all things.
Right. Yeah.
Jon, thanks for being with us, man. Thanks for
honored
your willingness
to do it.
to share
Thank you.
your story and your heart and your spirit with us. I just love it. Here's the deal. What I know is that at some point we're going to be in a stuck situation. Sometimes that's a stuck situation relationally. Sometimes that's organizationally. In our leadership, we're just going to get stuck. And the enemy tries to come at that point and just push all, as John said earlier, the insecurity buttons. He's going to try and tell us that we can't lead, that we're not good leaders. Here's what I want to remind all of us. Even Moses had tough days. Even Jesus had times when he looked at his disciples and said, are you guys going to leave me too? There are tough days as leaders. That doesn't mean that God isn't with us. It doesn't mean that we're not right smack in the middle of where God wants us to be. My prayer for you is that if you're in a stuck situation, that you'll sense that God is still working. And here's the deal. If you have a friend that maybe is in a stuck situation, can I encourage you to share this podcast with them? It might be the very thing that just encourages their spirit in a way that would be really meaningful to them. And also, do me a favor, if you would share or subscribe wherever you take this content in, that would be a huge blessing to us. Here's the thing, as Spirit-Anointed leaders, we're going to have great days and we're going to have hard days. My heart for you is that we would experience the goodness of God on both the great days and the hard days. He's still working. I love you so much. I believe in you. Have a great day.